If I talk to somebody about welfare mothers or something like that, they say how debilitating it is to have these food stamps and it takes away their incentive to do anything. If a kid comes out of the right womb in this country, they've got food stamps for the rest of their life. They just call them stocks and bonds, and their welfare officer is their trust officer.
Out of all the billionaires in the world, Warren Buffett is probably the least hated. I believe the reason for this is because, compared to other billionaires, Buffett is the most grounded and self-aware of his luck and the croniness of the very capitalist system that allowed him to become rich. Despite obviously being a textbook capitalist, Buffett acknowledges the various limitations of capitalism that most other billionaires would be too ideological to admit. Here are numerous instances in which Buffett has admitted that there are many limitations to capitalism and that the system is practically rigged in favor of the wealthy.
The market system is brutal, and it leaves behind people who are perfectly wonderful people who don't have market-related talents.
And who are just unlucky.
Yeah, just plain unlucky.
And the extreme rich are clearly winning. I mean, if you look at the Forbes 400, they had an aggregate net worth of $92 billion in 1982. It's $2.3 trillion today, 25 times.
But I can make no argument in my mind that says that I, with everything that, all the luck I've had in life, I was wired a certain way at birth that enabled me to make a lot of money, and frankly, it was better to be born a boy than a girl in terms of money-making possibilities in 1930.
I don't blame Governor Romney for paying the tax rate he paid. I blame the U.S. Congress.
Do you think this will be a defining issue in this year's election?
I think it should be a defining issue. Debbie works just as hard as I do, and she pays at twice the rate I pay. I think that's outrageous.
Quote, the 1% work harder. Do the 1% work harder?
Well, Sam may, I don't know, but plenty of people that I know who are very wealthy work very hard, and plenty of people I know that are very wealthy don't do a damn thing.
And while he is by no means innocent, Buffett is quite aware and has been public about there being a case of class warfare in the United States over the past few decades, and the rich have been winning. In doing so, I would argue that Buffett unintentionally makes a case as to why we should move beyond capitalism as a whole. So regardless of your views of socialism or whatever solutions to capitalism, hold your horses because we need to talk about capitalism first, and in order to even conceive of any possible solution, we have to understand the problem in the first place. Now, first things first, how exactly does the stock market even work, and how do people like Warren Buffett amass such giant fortunes? You hear about the stock market all the time, but most people don't really know how it works, and how it is essentially a rigged cash cow for people who already have a lot of money. Mainstream media coverage makes it seem like the performance of the stock market is in some way indicative of how the overall economy is doing, and how it is a fair system because those who take many risks get rewarded. But this is a bunch of bullcrap that people in suits constantly tell you so that you can continue to stay blissfully ignorant while capitalists continue to profit from the value that workers produce. Now, stocks are a form of capital that represent a part ownership of a business. If you buy shares of a company in the form of stocks, that makes you entitled to a small slice of the company's profit in the form of dividends, but the real source of wealth in stocks is being able to sell these stocks at a higher valuation once a company's overall value and share price increase. Now, the stock market is the aggregation of buyers and sellers of stocks which are listed on the public stock exchange, such as the NYSE. However, most companies are not publicly traded, and before they go public, it is a lot harder for investors to acquire shares of companies that are private. It is only when a company goes public in an event called an IPO, in which any investors can simply buy shares of that company, if they have enough money to do so. Now, Warren Buffett is known for arguably being the most successful investor of all time. Instead of investing in something cool or innovative like the iPhone, the computer, Google, or starting a life-changing business, Buffett has made most of his money just from investing in the stock market, in companies which are not particularly very exciting. Buffett runs a company called Berkshire Hathaway with his fellow billionaire friend Charlie Munger. Berkshire Hathaway is a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that invests money into large corporations like Coca-Cola and Heinz. It's essentially a company that invests in other companies. Buffett is just known for buying companies that are already big and monopolistic when they are supposedly undervalued or during economic crashes, such as when Buffett bought $1 billion worth of Coca-Cola shares in 1988, shortly after the 1987 stock market crash. Now, what exactly is wrong with the stock market? Now, if I had the available money to do so,
I've only got 7.
I could buy shares of, let's say, Google, which is like F that. Okay, never mind. Let's say I wanted to get some shares of, I don't know, Domino's Pizza. Let's say the average person has $2,000 to invest, they could buy around 5 shares. Meanwhile, Rich Ryan over here, who has $1 million to invest, can buy over 2,600 shares. Do you see the problem? If you already have a lot of money, you can amass way more wealth than the actual employees of a company simply by buying shares of that very same company and sitting on your ass. And while theoretically the employees of the business can buy shares of their own company, they are not paid nearly enough to be able to do that to the extent that someone who already has a lot of money handed to them can. And typically, low-wage workers have many bills to pay, and far more economic hurdles that prevent them from simply just buying shares of a company and sitting on their ass. While the wages of workers typically don't change very much whether or not the company makes more or less profits, you as a shareholder are able to increase your wealth, as more investors respond to the increased earnings of the company by buying more shares of it, thereby raising its price and raising your future returns. Thus, the stock market system mainly benefits people who have a lot of money to invest, who can simply hand it to a fund manager who will compound it over time for them.
You know, I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million.
And or for those who enjoy spending all of their time reading charts and analyzing corporate earnings reports. These groups of people who make up the capitalist class can make a lot more money just in the stock market than an actual engineer at a company who works and creates material value for that company, but does not own a significant part of it, if any at all. As a result, it is not surprising that the stock market by its very nature increases wealth inequality by allowing rich people to get exponentially richer while the wages of workers for the companies remain stagnant. This produces billionaires like Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Bill Ackman, and George Soros, who have quite literally made most of their money sitting on their asses and buying and selling stocks. This begs the question as to whether the stock market is a form of exploitation. While the answer may be obvious to some people on the left, it is indeed exploitative like all forms of capital, but not in the ways you might expect. See, the majority of wealth that individuals generate from the stock market is by buying shares at a lower price and eventually selling them to other investors indirectly at a much higher price. However, the main source of exploitation in the stock market would be dividends. See, not only do people increase their wealth by having their shares increase in value, but also by the regular dividends paid out to them. This is especially the case with mega corporations that have a lot of excess cash but don't need to reinvest much of it into the company's innovation. So as a result, instead of using that money to raise the wages of their workers, they pay very large dividends to keep shareholders happy and investing in that company, even though it's not producing anything new or innovative, which of course obviously benefits those with the most amount of shares. This is exploitation in the most literal sense because the excess revenue that a company makes is going to the shareholders who do nothing instead of the actual workers, who the company depends on a lot more than anybody else. For example, Ronald McDonald's pays a dividend of about 2.5% a year, so that's around $5 a share. This means that if you are a rich person who owns 10,000 shares, which would amount to around $2 million at around
2 + 2 is 4, -1, that's 3, quick maths.
$208 a share, at the time of recording this video at least, you would get $50,000 in cash every year in the form of dividends for doing absolutely jack shit. And that's not including the profit that shareholders would make over the long run after the share price increases over many years. Rich people essentially have their UBI. They have their welfare. It's just called stocks, as Warren Buffett himself admits. The revenue generated by companies does not go to the workers. It goes to the shareholders, to CEO salaries, and sometimes companies even use extra revenue to buy shares of their own stock. Talk about a functioning system. Now, in defense, bootlicking billionaire apologists would probably say that investors like Warren Buffett are great for society because they provide liquidity to the market, or foster innovation. Yeah, right. Like investing billions of dollars in Coca-Cola helps anything. In fact, the stock market does not typically encourage life-changing innovations most of the time, because most investors are deterred from investing in more risky companies without high cash flows. Companies like Beyond Meat, who do help solve a very important problem when it comes to cattle emissions, are considered too risky, and people would prefer to just put money into companies that are already too big to fail. Let's take a look at some of Warren Buffett's largest investments of his career. Bank of America, Coca-Cola, Apple, in 2015 may I add, after it was already the biggest company in the world. American Express, Kraft Heinz. Very innovative, Mr. Buffett. Your liquidity is such a great help to the world. I'm sure all those underpaid workers who work for the companies that you invest in surely benefit from it. But hey, I'm not saying that Buffett himself is evil as an individual. He is just a smart player in a fundamentally crooked system. But it does not have to be this way. Some people will often use the word to describe the system as crony capitalism, but it's really just capitalism. Before debating how to fix the system, it is important that we first understand what capitalism even is, because most people surprisingly don't understand what actually differentiates capitalism from other economic systems, or how it even came into existence historically. Now, as mentioned before, stocks are a form of capital. In this case, they are particularly a form of what can be called fictitious capital. Capital that is not actually held or controlled materially, but rather just a documentation of capital. Numbers on a screen, which represent ownership, and those numbers on a screen increase as the share price increases. See, capital is not just a form of money, like many people seem to think. And capitalism is not a system that is just defined by having markets or being able to make large sums of money. These are all misconceptions. Markets existed far before capitalism, and the capitalist system itself didn't even arise until private landowners under mercantilism and rich merchants were getting so wealthy from international trade that they were like, hey, why does the king have to have so much power? Let's just take all the power ourselves and make up some bullshit reasons like liberty, justice, and some shit. Capitalism is defined by private ownership over the means of production. This means that instead of having people who do the actual work be automatically entitled to a share of that business, workers are bought and sold in the very same way that machinery or materials are for the business. They are essentially disposable tools for the capitalist. Wage labor is very efficient for capitalists because they can ensure that they pay the minimum amount possible regardless of how hard the capitalist actually makes their employees work, and yet still get paid the same wage. In feudal economies, serfs were given a set amount of labor to do for the day, and once they did it, that was it. They could choose how to spend the rest of their time. Now, this is not necessarily a better system by any means, but it is important to note that all the good things that we often attribute to capitalism, such as democratic rights, having the weekend off, social security, and having basic labor rights, were not granted originally, and were fought for by militant labor movements, most of which were anarchist, Marxist, or other kind of left-wing socialists. These things were not inherent components of capitalism, and given the choice, most of these capitalists would be against the rights that these workers have won. In the early stages of capitalism, people had to work until they died. Now, this is in no way saying that capitalism is worse or the same as feudalism, but many of the major improvements that we have in life, or at least that many developed countries have, are not attributed to the capitalist system itself, but rather the efforts of workers to win over these freedoms. This is why it is important to debunk many of the arguments and billionaire apologist defenses that people have for the capitalist system, particularly as it pertains to the stock market system. Debunking some myths and billionaire apologist arguments. One rebuttal that you would often hear in defense of the capitalist system is that investors take more risk, and therefore they should be rewarded more. Not only is this not entirely true, as stated earlier, that investors actually often avoid risk, but the truth is that regardless of how much actual risk is taken, workers always pay the consequences, but are not entitled to the rewards. If the risks taken by the businessmen and investors fail and they lose money, so do the workers. They lose their jobs. In reality, there is always a lot of risk for the workers. Because if a company screws up or a bunch of its investors decide to sell its stock, the company would likely fire many of its workers, as the banks did in the 2008 crash, and many tech startup companies did in the 2000s .com crash. Sometimes, even when a company performs well, it still fires more workers so that it can cut down costs of production to meet higher expectations of net revenue. This is because under capitalism, workers are quite literally treated as tools. You are a tool for capital that can be bought and sold. There is no democracy under a capitalist workplace. Every capitalist enterprise, unless it is a worker cooperative, is essentially a dictatorship. Another rebuttal made by conservatives is that anybody can become rich if they just start a business, work hard, or better yet, invest in the stock market. If we are just taught more about finance and how the stock market works, then everybody could be able to manage their money well, right? This is an absolutely stupid argument for many reasons. First, it ignores the fact that much of the reason why many people are so in debt, particularly in America, is because of the rising cost of living, particularly exacerbated by real estate investment in housing, healthcare, and post-secondary education, as well as the shrinking number of available jobs and the stagnant decline of wages since the 1980s. Secondly, no amount of financial literacy or education will change the fact that people who start off with way more money will have a disproportionately higher chance of making a lot more wealth in the stock market than a person starting out with less. Plus, what also contradicts the idea that anybody can benefit from the stock market and that it creates prosperity for all is that historically, when masses of regular people actually entered the stock market, it didn't go very well, as seen in the dot-com bubble and even worse in the 1929 stock market crash. Not only that, but the stock market requires winners and losers to function. When the masses get in the stock market, there is less and less buyers left and only sellers, which leads to what is called a bubble, and that bubble bursting as everybody sells, because there is nobody left to buy. This logic of winners and losers applies to capitalism in general. For large segments of the population to become ultra-rich, other populations have to stay poor and be exploited. Because quite literally, the way capitalists get rich in the first place is by feeding off of the labor of somebody else. In fact, many of the supposedly good things that we get out of capitalism and the rising standard of living in developed countries are the result of exploiting labor in the third world. You would not be able to get your beloved smartphones at such a cheap price if it weren't for exploiting cheap labor overseas. In fact, much of the American middle class would not even be able to keep up with its standard of living if it weren't for the debt economy fueled by the credit boom in the United States, in which people who are in no way capable of actually paying back their loans are able to take as much debt as they want to keep up with a standard of living that they can fundamentally not afford. Part of which is what amounted to the 2008 housing bubble. Now, a third point, which even liberals ignore, is that having more equality of opportunity does not solve the problem either, because not everybody wants to become a billionaire in the first place. Nor do we even need billionaires. As Buffett admits himself, not everybody has an interest in finance. And truth be told, that is pretty boring. Not everybody has the desire to accumulate $1 billion, and those who do tend to typically be the most cutthroat, power-hungry type of people most of the time anyway. So what's the solution? Well, before getting into this debate, let's look at what Mr. Warren Buffett himself thinks. Buffett has been quite clear that capitalism does have many limitations and is overly generous to people of his own economic class. But does he advocate for a way of fixing this problem? Let's find out.
I would say this in terms of Sanders. I actually agree with him in terms of certain things he would like to accomplish. I don't agree with him in many ways, but in terms of the fact that we ought to do better by the people that get left behind by our capitalist system. I don't think we should kill the capitalist system in the process. I think we should make sure that the golden goose keeps laying more eggs, and it's worked wonderfully since 1776. But it doesn't work as well for people whose talents aren't really geared to a market economy. And I don't think anybody should be left behind by an economy that has over $60,000 of GDP per capita. And so I'm a big fan of increasing the earned income tax credit. And I think there should be some changes made. But if given a choice, I would certainly vote for Mike Bloomberg as opposed to Sanders.
Here Buffett is admitting that the capitalist system leaves people behind and that there is no excuse for the richest country in the history of the world to have so much poverty and homeless people. However, Buffett's implied solution of expanding the earned income tax credit is an absolute joke. The earned income tax credit has been tried, and expanding it would not really help people that much because they don't make much money in the first place. Let's see how Buffett reacts to some of Bernie Sanders' solutions, which are not fully anti-capitalist, but include some socialist aspects.
There is a plan. Let's talk about some of Sanders' plans. You said you agree with some of what his intentions are, but let's talk about some of those actual plans. One of those plans would be to give 20% of company stock to employees and put workers on the board. What do you think about that? That would be for any company, public company, that has more than $100 million in annual revenue or a $100 million balance.
Well, I don't want to get involved in evaluating his whole plan, but I think that would be a particularly bad idea.
Because?
Well, I don't think putting 20% of the capitalists on a labor union is a good idea either. And I believe in having a higher income for people, not necessarily a higher minimum wage, but I do not think it's at all unreasonable that the income tax credit produces at least $15 an hour, maybe higher in certain areas.
What Buffett is essentially saying is that he wants a solution to the problem that capitalism causes, as long as it does not affect him or people of his economic class. Buffett gives no actual reason for not supporting Bernie's plan, no argument to refute it, because the reason is obvious. Buffett is not just protecting his own interests here, but the interests of his entire class. That includes his family who will be inheriting money from him, his billionaire contemporaries, his fellow investors, who would all freak out if he endorsed any policy that would in any way affect their capital interests. Plus, what Buffett is saying about the market system being the best system ever and being behind why the United States is successful is completely wrong and also irrelevant when it comes to Bernie's proposal. Bernie Sanders did not aim to throw out the market system, and his proposal was quite modest. The only socialist aspect of Bernie Sanders' plan was to have 20% of the profits of a corporation be allocated to the workers, in the form of a fund which every worker would have access to. Which sounds quite fair, considering that they are the ones who literally provide value for the company by making it work in the first place. But of course, Buffett would be terrified of that, as it has big implications on his billionaire contemporaries and fellow investors. Buffett says that he agrees with a lot of Bernie's intentions, but at the same time that he would also prefer Michael Bloomberg over Bernie in the 2020 Democratic primaries. Here we can see how Buffett is quite conflicted, knowing how the capitalist system has all of these consequences, but at the same time any bold solution to these problems would affect his class interests, so he does not really commit to supporting anything. A wealth tax on inherited property as well as capital gains is a popular solution proposed by many social democrats such as the economist Thomas Piketty and Robert Reich. But more Marxist thinkers such as David Harvey and Richard Wolff would argue instead that this does not address the core root of the problem, which is the fact that under capitalism, people who work for companies and produce value for them are not guaranteed shares in those companies or have a democratic say in their leaders. In fact, it is usually shareholders of large corporations who elect the corporate board of directors, not employees. As Buffett himself admits, secretaries can work a lot more but make far less than a venture capitalist, and even pay a higher percentage in taxes than a venture capitalist would just by buying and selling stocks. The problem of ownership under capitalism is one that socialist thinkers have identified for a long time, most notably Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Now forget all your presuppositions for a moment. I think it's fair to say that Karl Marx knew quite a lot about capitalism, especially considering that he wrote 3 goddamn volumes about it in Das Kapital. I mean seriously, these shits are like 1,000 pages each. Interestingly, Marx and Engels were quite savvy capitalists themselves, with Friedrich Engels inheriting a textile factory and Karl Marx being quite a savvy stock trader in the German and English stock markets, before the stock market was as advanced and massive as it is now, of course. This might seem a little hypocritical considering that Marx and Engels were 2 of the most famous critics of capitalism, but they did not critique the system solely on a moral level, but rather analyzed it from a historical perspective and the objective economic conditions that it produced. It's not just about saying rich people bad, poor people good, kill all the rich people and let everybody be poor. That's not at all what Karl Marx and Engels said or even advocated for. Also, right-wingers who hate on socialists for just trying to make a living in a very cutthroat system that they have no choice to be a part of often forget that libertarian thinkers like Ayn Rand, who were very against government intervention in programs at all costs, depended on welfare and social security before they died. Ironically. Now, there's a couple of core systemic issues in capitalism that Mr. Santa Claus analyzed which no Keynesian, neoliberal, or libertarian theory can account for. One of these issues was alluded to earlier, which concerns the problem of ownership, as workers don't own their actual labor, or the means of production that they use to do their work with. Workers are part of what Marx calls the variable cost of labor. They can be manipulated in order to reduce surplus value, and the net revenue that a company makes is part of this surplus value. Now, the emphasis on variable cost is very important here, because it is one of the main reasons as to why wages do not always go up with productivity or the overall economic success of an economy. This is why it should be no surprise that wages did not increase after the 1980s rise of neoliberal rugged capitalism, in which companies got a lot more profit, but workers' wages were largely stagnant. It is this reason as to why we can't get mad at people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk for not paying their workers more fairly, as the capitalist system incentivizes and pressures companies to cut down labor costs as much as possible. Let's take a look at Amazon, for example. Before it was the e-commerce giant that it is today, Amazon started to get a ton of investor hype ever since it started expanding into the global e-commerce market instead of just becoming an online bookstore. Hype about their ambitions raised the company's stock price up a lot, making their valuation a lot higher and thereby putting a lot more pressure on their expansions and future profits. For Amazon to achieve their goal of becoming the #1 e-commerce giant and to fulfill the revenue expectations of investors, they had to keep wages low as possible, as they could get away with at least, and productivity to its max so that they could deliver products faster than any other platform in the world. For not just Amazon, but mostly all capitalist enterprises, variable cost is a crucial component for manipulating revenue, because if a company is not selling as many goods and services to keep up with earnings expectations, they can still cut labor costs or even fire some workers in order to maximize net revenue, making it look a lot better than it actually is. This is why Tesla, as well as other large companies, fired many workers when the pandemic hit, despite the fact that their stock still kept rising like crazy due to investor expectations over Tesla's promising ambitions, which is why Elon Musk is pressured to keep labor costs low as possible and to prevent workers from unionizing. This is why so many billionaires, including Buffett himself, are against raising the minimum wage. And this is in no way a defense of people like Elon Musk or Amazon, but rather this is just the way that the capitalist system works. And the point is that we cannot just rely on big CEOs to do the right thing. Simply, the problem is within the system. No matter what CEO is in power, these companies would all be taking similar measures which are incentivized by the capitalist system. Now, another fundamental problem in capitalism, which is heavily correlated with the stock market, is what is often referred to as the boom-bust cycle, which is one of the most widely respected concepts in Marxist theory. It should be pretty obvious to anyone at this point that capitalism has a tendency to crash every 5 or 10 years. Sometimes it starts with a problem rooted in the economy itself, and then manifests in the stock market, as seen in the 2008 crash. Or sometimes it quite literally just starts in the stock market through the formulation of a massive bubble, which results in companies going bankrupt and the firing of workers to prevent as much net loss as possible.
What could someone do to, educate themselves, prepare, and take advantage of a potential crash?
What's wrong with a crash? That's what people don't understand. Crashes are really good.
Yeah.
You know, crashes are basically like Neiman Marcus having a sale.
Right.
So in 2008, when the markets crashed, they also lowered the interest rates. I thought I died and went to heaven.
In periods of economic crisis, wealth inequality is typically exacerbated as wealthy capitalists are able to buy up stocks at a much cheaper price and thus get a much more massive long-term profit, while regular people lose their jobs and struggle. The media likes to blame capitalism's crises on individual actors, such as greedy bankers, while social democratic liberals often blame the lack of government regulation. On the other hand, libertarians think that if you simply got the government out of the way, everything would be fine. Here is why all these perspectives are wrong. For starters, if a system allows or incentivizes people to be greedy and do fraudulent things in the first place, they will do so. If you think that the problem is just corporate greed, then you miss the entire point of the movie called The Big Short, which clearly shows how it was the result of a completely broken system and not just individual actors. Secondly, social democratic liberals who think that we can just bring back some old regulations and introduce some new ones are also wrong, because these government regulations only existed in the first place to save capitalism from collapsing due to the intrinsic flaws that it already had. Not only do these regulations prove to be unstable, but if a system has so many contradictions in the first place that the only way for it to save itself is by harsh regulations which would easily be repealed by future governments anyway, then maybe we should move to an entirely new system altogether. Before getting into too much depth as to which solution we should have, which would necessitate an entire new video altogether, we need to truly understand the overlooked aspects of capitalism which prevent people from coming to more radical and creative solutions. To recognize these overlooked problems in capitalism is the first step into even considering what a solution should be. One aspect of capitalism that is highly misunderstood is the relationship between the state and the capitalist economy. What's so interesting about economic crashes is how the Federal Reserve always seems to prioritize the stock market above all else. After the US stock market absolutely plummeted in March 2020 due to rising fears about the coronavirus, the Federal Reserve literally printed trillions, and I mean trillions, of US dollars to buy up US equities, bonds, and to loan money to big banks. They also gave billions of dollars in corporate welfare in the form of bailouts to corporations, many of which used the money to buy up their own stock, while still firing thousands of workers and cutting pay.
Who wants free money?
Money?
Free money!
Now, free market capitalist ideologues will always talk about how they hate the government until they become totally defenseless against a crisis and then beg the nanny state for handouts. Companies and shareholders get their welfare with printed money for doing absolutely nothing, while regular working people who make the entire company function can't even get $2,000 stimulus checks. Fun fact, 23.6% of all US dollars were created in 2020. This sounds absolutely mind-blowingly hard to believe, but it's a fact. And if you think that we're ever going to pay back this money and that the deficit really matters, I would encourage you to check out modern monetary theory. While modern monetary theory is a neo-Keynesian type theory, it is being informally practiced already by the neoliberal/neoconservative United States government.
and there is an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve. We will do whatever we need to do to make sure that there's enough cash in the banking system.
Studies have shown that ending homelessness would only cost $20 billion in the United States, and free college would cost approximately $79 billion. Still, these things are not considered a priority for a capitalist state and are deemed as unrealistic, despite only being a fraction of the cost that the Federal Reserve was willing to pump for the stock market. Right-wing libertarians would point to the government's response by saying that the Federal Reserve is the #1 driver of inequality, and that everything would just be fine if we had a pure free market capitalism and the state got out of the way. While it is true in recent decades that the Federal Reserve has drastically increased inequality by inflating assets and giving giant corporate bailouts, inequality was always a problem under capitalism, and was slightly worse under the era of laissez-faire capitalism, in which 3 men own 99% of all the wealth. Now, the #1 thing that many people fail to understand about how capitalism works is that the state is a necessary component of capitalism. The United States government was designed to be objectively capitalist since its very inception. The state in a capitalist society serves a few main purposes. First is to promote the expansion of private capital. Second is to protect private property and to preserve capital. When the Founding Fathers wrote about liberty in the United States Constitution, they were not talking about democratic freedom or liberty in the sense that we often think of today. For them, liberty meant the freedom to own slaves, land, and ownership in companies, all of which was more restricted to the royalties in feudal systems. In a similar vein, the United States electoral system is deliberately set up to prevent the masses from taking control of their own destiny, which is quite literally expressed in the Federalist Papers in what James Madison and John Adams called a tyranny of the majority, something they feared and loathed, because one reason why true democracy is incompatible with the capitalist system is because it is designed intentionally to serve the wealthy capitalist class, and therefore the slight prospect of the masses taking control of their own destiny is terrifying. One historical fact that a lot of people don't know about is that the police force was invented in Great Britain for the sole purpose of protecting private property, as tensions grew between the landowning class, peasants, and the working class. In Great Britain and the United States, the police were invented within the space of just a few decades, roughly from 1825 to 1855. The purpose of the police was fundamentally to shut down strikes, riots, and slave insurrections. Domestic crime was more so an afterthought. Now, in recent history, it is no coincidence that Barack Obama drastically militarized the police force to the point where they were indistinguishable from the military in order to crush Occupy Wall Street protesters, which Trump later used on Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Lastly, most of the other roles of the state could be boiled down to one-third duty, and that is to mediate class conflict. This one is a little bit different than protecting capital, but it serves the same purpose. While we may think of things like Social Security, Medicare, welfare, and basic labor rights as things that the government just does to ensure the well-being of citizens, these things did not exist in a capitalist society until workers fought tooth and nail for them, with militant strikes, riots, and political victories. Hell, we didn't even get a 5-day work week, an 8-hour work day, or even holidays like Labor Day until plenty of militant labor strikes and political assassinations. The point of the story is that in a system that is built to preserve capital, the state will naturally always prioritize the wealthy elites over regular people. And no matter who you elect, as long as the fundamentals of the capitalist system are not changed, where people take ownership over what they produce, these problems will never go away. Anyways, the point of the video is that the stock market is one of the core arenas of capital accumulation, and is one of the fundamental drivers of making the rich get richer, widening the divide between the capitalist class and the working class, which is amplified further by the disconnect between the conditions of the stock market and the actual economy of labor. Now, we covered a lot of ground, and I wanted to cover even more. And if you want to learn more on this topic, I would recommend the reading recommendations in the description, which you can find in the links below. And I will also be doing a exclusive podcast on my Patreon, in which I will be exploring the issue of the stock market and particularly postmodern capitalism in detail. If you don't like reading, these podcasts can be a very easy way to learn and get a lot of information in a short amount of time. Plus, you'll also be supporting the livelihood of this channel, and it'll make it easier to produce videos of this quality more consistently. Or I can just use the money to gamble on penny stocks and buy Dogecoin. Just kidding, I need to pay off my tuition debt.